Hey folks, and welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 6, where we're talking about the philosophy of religion, and today we're looking at the problem of evil, reading a piece by a fellow named William Rowe, titled The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. So, usual plan of attack, where we start with the general, we hit the specifics, and then evaluate, and I leave you with a few things to consider. In this case in particular, we're going to start with the usual quick recap of the relevant positions. We're going to look at how to frame the problem of evil, that is, its context, what it's trying to say, what it's not trying to say, how it's presented, and then we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty of Rowe's presentation of the argument from evil, which is the argument based on the problem of evil that we'll be talking about. We'll then spend some time looking at possible theist responses to it, since this is an argument for atheism to help balance out our unit. And then, like usual, we'll wrap up by briefly considering the potential success or failure of the argument, and I'll leave you with some food for thought as we move forward and continue our studies. So, let's get down to it, shall we? Last time, or all of the last times, depending on what order you're reading these or listening to these in, we've been looking into the philosophy of religion. That is, we've been looking into the fundamental principles, the fundamental ideas that really make up religion, especially our question, which is simply, does God exist? Which, in a lot of ways, is the most fundamental question you could ask about religious topics, or at least for those religions in which God's relevant, or some form of the divine is relevant. I bring this up because I think it's worth reminding us, or reminding you, that for our purposes, we're using the term God to refer to an omnicompetent being. That is, a being that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. Or, in the case of the cosmological argument, or a few other religions that this sort of thing may be relevant for, we'll use God to refer to the name of whatever it is that is the most basic, explanatory fact of the universe, and what possesses the greatest possible value in that same universe. Now, that's the terminology. In response to our question, we've been talking about the two basic positions that one can take, either theism or atheism. And these are quite simply the positions, one, theism being the idea that an omnicompetent being, God, in our vocabulary, exists, and atheism being the denial of this sort of position. Again, these aren't the only positions you can take. There's also agnosticism, and a wide variety of variations on both theism and atheism and agnosticism. But these are the ones we're focusing on. Now, so far, we've been looking at theistic arguments, that is, the arguments in favor of theism. We've been looking at ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, basically varieties of arguments that can be made in support of theism. Perhaps they don't definitively prove it, but they attempt to give some sort of a demonstration or a set of reasons in favor of theism. Now it's the atheist's turn, because, as always, I try and be as well-rounded and neutral in these units as I possibly can be. So it's time to look at the opposite side of the debate. Now, usually, atheists end up simply denying many of the theist arguments. That's the usual way of arguing and presenting these things. Usually atheists start from the simple position that there's no evidence for God, and that's enough for a lot of atheists. But there's at least one strong arrow in the atheist quiver, so to speak, and that is the argument from evil, which is also called the problem of evil. We'll use the two terms roughly interchangeably throughout. The argument for the specific argument, the problem for the topic as a whole. Now, this one doesn't have as many famous statements or as famous presentations as the cosmological argument or the ontological. There's no single medieval guy we're going to look at to study the argument from evil. Instead, we're going to look at a contemporary presentation of it, one that has sort of helped revitalize the philosophy of religion since the 1970s by a fellow named William Rowe, who, as chance may have it, is actually a former Purdue professor. So, hail Purdue. Now, his isn't quite as historically famous as, say, Anselm's argument or Aquinas' work or something like that. But it's probably the most widely read version of the problem of evil, and it's probably the single most influential piece in modern philosophy of religion. So, that's why we're going to look at it. And again, The general idea is that just like for theism, there are arguments that can be given in favor of atheism purely based on reason, which is why this is something that gets included in philosophy. It's not that philosophy is, as hopefully you've seen already in this unit, it's not that it exclusively leans towards atheism or any of the other hogwash that gets thrown out in pop culture now and then. But instead we try and find reasons for various positions. And because we've been looking at the theistic stuff so far, I feel like we ought to look at one of the oldest, most influential, and most persuasive atheistic arguments to try and balance things out. Like I was saying, Rowe's version of this argument is perhaps the most famous modern one, but it actually goes back a quite long ways. The Greek, or I guess Hellenistic, to be technical, precise about it, the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus gave us a version of this, which you can see on the right side of your screen, all the way back to 300 BC, and it's probably even older than that. The idea is very simple. The existence of evil poses some sort of a problem for those who believe in God. And we'll see just how much of a problem this is and how the problem actually works here over the next several minutes, depending on how much you pause this, and so on and so forth. The joys of online classes. So, the basic idea is not unlike the cosmological argument. I think this is worth pointing out. It's revolving around the discussion of a certain number of facts about the world. The argument from evil, or the problem of evil, the topic in general, basically says that there are facts about the world that when we try and join them up with the fact that we're really interested in, the potential fact of God's existence, whether or not God exists, when you put those two things together, these certain facts about the world and our question at hand, we actually sort of get a problem. There's a need for an explanation going on. And if the theist can't give an adequate answer, if the theist can't fully explain how these two facts are supposed to fit together, then the argument for evil says that we should reject the idea of God's existence. Or to sum it up the same way we did the cosmological argument, given that the world is a certain way, there's reason to believe that God doesn't exist. So in a way, we're still appealing to the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR. We don't really talk about it in this lecture, and our reading doesn't discuss it, but it's really the same sort of idea churning in the background of this sort of thing. We're trying to say that, well, the world is a certain way, and there needs to be a reason that the world is a certain way. And so we try and see if God can be that reason, or if that reason potentially causes an issue for God, or for the existence of God, I should say. And depending on how convincing you find the argument, you'll either say that it does or it doesn't. Now, as far as our categories go, for classifying and understanding the arguments in the philosophy of religion, or arguments just in general, this sort of structure, this focus on facts about the world, makes the argument from evil an a posteriori argument. That means that it relies on our experiences of the world rather than just revolving around concepts alone. So rather than just focusing on, well, because God's such and such a way, it's impossible that he exists. Some people try and advance arguments like that. This isn't one of those. Instead, concepts like our concept of God, at least at the theoretical level, does still play a role. But overall, the argument really revolves around a posteriori claims, just like the cosmological argument does. It says because we've experienced the world, because we've learned certain things about it, we've got reason to say some of these other things. In this case, it's the existence of evil. It's the existence of intense suffering and other extremely bad things in the universe that the argument really focuses on. Now, I will say that if you are particularly widely read, you might be aware of the fact that there is an a priori version of the argument, where it says something like, because the concept of God and the concept of evil are with the way that they are, the two can't fit together. The two are impossible, in the same way that roundness and squareness cannot both be in the same object. Roundness requires no corners, a square requires 4 corners, so there's some sort of clash there. Some people try and advance a version of the argument from evil that works that same way. They say there's something about the concept of God and there's something about the concept of evil or about suffering where the two just really don't fit together. But very, very, very few people actually endorse or use that sort of argument these days. It's been, I hate to say this in philosophy, but it's been largely debunked. It'd take a very brilliant and new philosopher to advance a workable version of the so-called logical argument from evil. So instead, we generally work on with the a posteriori version of it. So that's what we're going to focus on. Ideally, if we had an entire year or semester to focus on philosophy of religion, something I'd love to do sometime, we would go into all the different varieties and all sorts of the different responses and the debates that surround it. But since we only have the one time, the one lecture, we'll focus on the a posteriori version. As I said before, specifically the argument from evil focuses on the fact about the world that the world has evil in it. It's got really bad stuff in it that gives us reason to think that God doesn't exist. And what precisely I mean by that, we'll get to here in just a second. In particular, I want to clarify some of the things that the argument says and doesn't say. I think the very last statement on this slide, the fact that the world has evil in it, and this fact gives us reason to think that God doesn't exist. Honestly, I think that statement's probably the best place to start looking at what the argument does and doesn't say, and it's an important one to try and remember. Because just like the theistic arguments, we don't want to just look at like some crazy version of the argument from evil. We want to be charitable. We want to discuss and engage with the best possible version or the most reasonable version of the arguments on both sides of any debate, but especially the religion one, since it's so personal and so important to the people who participate in religious life or discuss religious topics. So with that in mind, rather than talking about the argument of evil as a definitive proof that God doesn't exist, just in the same way we didn't talk about the ontological or cosmological arguments as proofs of God's existence, instead it's worth talking about them in terms of the reasons that they give us for their respective positions. In this case, the problem of evil, or the argument from evil, gives us reasons to deny the existence of God, reasons to endorse atheism. It doesn't try and prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt or anything like that, but rather it simply tries to give a rational basis for the position that it speaks to, the position that's relevant to it. And that's partly because the a posteriori nature of the argument is always going to leave a little possibility that at the end of the day, we've just not experienced enough to be able to definitively speak about the topics involved. And partly it's also just good philosophy. A good philosopher is somebody who's going to be intellectually humble to a certain degree. So a good philosopher is always going to admit, yeah, I could be wrong about this. I'm going to try and be as rational with my arguments and my beliefs as possible, but I have to admit that perhaps this isn't the only thing one could say about the topic. And because we're looking at this version of the argument from evil, the a posteriori version, it's sometimes referred to as the evidentiary argument from evil. That is, it's focused around trying to find evidence for atheism, or it gives us evidence for atheism, rather than saying that it definitively proves it in some sort of a logical way, like the a priori or logical version of the problem does. I think it's also worth clarifying that when we talk about evil, and I'm going to use the word a lot over the course of this lecture, simply because it's the traditional way of talking about these sorts of things, we're not just talking about people like Hitler and Pol Pot and so on, like all the classic evil dudes of history or fiction. So we're not just talking about what you might call moral evils, evils involving with immoral acts or things that are like sadistic and cruel. We're not just talking about that stuff. Instead, the argument from evil also includes and discusses things we might call natural evils. And by this I don't mean that like they naturally happen, although they usually do. But instead we're talking about things that are not necessarily morally relevant. Things like natural disasters, landslides, plagues, intense suffering, pain that's not necessarily inflicted by anybody else. These are sorts of things that the argument from evil discusses in addition to moral evils. So the argument from evil could point to things like the atrocities of the Holocaust, but it might also point to, and in Rowe's case does point to, things that don't really have human agents involved. Things like earthquakes, things like forest fires. And you'll see what I mean by that example here in a few minutes. Or if you already did the reading, good for you, you know where I'm going with this. I guess the basic point is the argument from evil uses both of these as evidence against the existence of God. Rowe, in particular, also points out that the argument from evil as presented only targets what he refers to as narrow theism. That is, theism that follows the definition we've been using in this unit. Theism that asserts the existence of an omnicompetent God. There are, as I mentioned in the intro lecture, a wide variety of theisms and a wide variety of atheisms that one could endorse. For example, one might say, follow the philosopher Baruch Spinoza and say that pantheism is true, that God is identical to the whole of the universe, rather than being some sort of a supernatural entity that acts on it, or some sort of omnipotent, omniscient being that acts separately from the universe. The problem of evil generally doesn't affect that type of theism very well. It doesn't affect Nirguna Brahman in Hinduism very well, or the emptiness or Buddha nature of some forms of Buddhism. Instead, it focuses on the what you might call classical theism of the Western world, because this is, for the most part, Western philosophy that we're studying. And this Rowe terms as narrow theism. So it uses the same definition we've been using this whole unit. So narrow theism, or the theism as far as this discussion is concerned with, is the position that endorses an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being, God. This particular form, Rowe thinks, is susceptible to the argument from evil. The others, perhaps, are just not simply don't find the argument relevant in any way. So I think that's very much worth clarifying. The argument from evil is a very powerful argument, but it definitely has its limits, or at least you'd have to very deeply adjust and reconsider certain elements of the argument to make it apply to other forms of theism. So, all things worth noting, I think we ought to go ahead and get to the problem itself at this point then. Because if you're going to listen to me talk for 30 minutes or whatever, you at least ought to get something substantial out of it instead of just context. So, here's the argument itself as far as William Rowe presents it. It's got two premises and then the conclusion. So nice, direct, and simple, just as it's meant to be. So the argument goes like this. Premise 1. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil that is equally bad or worse. Premise 2. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. I guess to clarify, we've not been talking about omniscience very much so far. You can kind of wrap that in with omnipotence, depending on your theory of the divine attributes. So, for the most part, although omniscience hasn't been discussed in this unit all that much, roll with it and assume that it is part of the same definition we've been talking about for however long you've been listening to these lectures. So, basic idea of the argument is, there is intense suffering in the world that effectively has no point. It doesn't lead to any greater good, it doesn't prevent some greater evil, it just is, and it sucks. And then premise 2 says that God, if he existed, or if God existed, to avoid the pronoun, if God existed, then God would prevent instances of intense suffering that don't have any other point, unless they do have some sort of a redeeming feature to them. They do lead to something greater, they prevent some evil, and therefore, because we do think that there are unprevented instances of intense suffering, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. God doesn't exist. Now, Rowe points out that this is a valid argument, although it is a little less formally stated maybe than some of our others that we've looked at, or some of the ones that I've written up for you. But it's a valid argument. So if we're going to discuss anything about this, it's not going to be in terms of the logical form of it. Validity is an easy thing to check, so it's not like we just have to take Rowe's word of this. Generally, if you want to, it's a pretty safe bet because it's really easy to disprove if it turns out not to actually be true. So, Roe pretty quickly states the argument and says, okay, it's valid. But there's still a lot of things we need to discuss, things we need to establish. So if we're going to discuss this at all, it needs to be in terms of whether these premises are correct, whether 1 or 2 are actually true premises. Which is in effect the same as asking, is the argument sound? We know it's valid, it's easy to see that it's valid. But we don't know whether or not it's actually sound. We don't know whether there's a rational basis for thinking that premise 1 or premise 2 is actually true. And that's really the most important part of this, because if we have a rational basis for thinking that 1 or 2 is true, then we also have a rational basis for accepting the conclusion, which is really what we're getting after here. So, Roe's going to go premise by premise, taking one at a time, and see, do we have good reason for thinking that it's true? And he starts off with premise 2, because he thinks that it's a pretty quick discussion there. To establish premise 2, Roe considers what would need to be the case for an omnicompetent God, the God of narrow theism, to permit some sort of intense suffering. And so he goes through conditions, and you get a little tiny sampling of what professional analytic philosophy looks like. It's rigorous, it touches on math, it uses formal logic quite a bit. And if you couldn't get through it because of the abbreviations or just the length of the sentences and propositions involved, that's fine, that's normal, even for professionals. It takes us a few rereads. The simple point of those few paragraphs in the reading is that in order for 2 to be true, God must either be gaining some greater good or preventing some equally bad or worse thing in order to permit suffering. Basically, he's establishing under what conditions would God allow suffering to happen. And those conditions are rather straightforward. Either, if you're going to permit suffering, you either need to be letting it happen to promote some greater good or prevent some equal or greater evil. Basic idea would be like something like this. When you go and exercise, it's painful if you're doing it right. The first few times that you're working a particular muscle group while lifting weights, when you run and finally are exerting yourself and actually burning fat and developing your aerobic system, it's exhausting. It's painful in some muscle areas. It wears you out. Sweating is unpleasant for a lot of people. So generally the process of exercise, especially if you're not used to it, is not always a pleasant one. A lot of people enjoy the after effects of it, or after a long enough time you might hit a runner's high, but for the most part, exercise is a form of suffering. So why is exercise still a good thing? It sounds kind of weird for me to be advocating this, or telling you that exercise is suffering. Well, the reason why people suffer through exercise is because it leads to something better, namely improved health. And that makes it totally worth going through the suffering of exercise. And we apply the same sort of reasoning in all sorts of places. You're suffering through the long and tedious process of getting an education because you think that it's worth it. You think there's something to be gained by the process of education, be it a job or improving yourself as a human being or pursuing some interest. I mean, surely, hopefully, a few of you actually enjoy doing this. But let's be real. A lot of you are doing this because you feel like you need to or you have to, not because you enjoy it. But that's okay, because hopefully you still see some value in doing it, which is why you're not a crazy person for doing this sort of thing. Premise 2 is using that same sort of reasoning. It's just doing it in the general form. It says that God would only permit intense suffering in the world if it pursues some greater goal. And this is something that generally both atheists and theists accept. Most theists, by definition, in our case, the way we've laid out theism, they believe that God's wholly good. They believe that God is entirely and perfectly morally good. So, God's going to have a good reason for allowing something bad like suffering to happen, if He permits it at all. Similarly, atheists, because it's a basic moral principle and it's a basic element of our pragmatic reasoning, also believe very much in premise 2. They're going to say that premise 2 is true. So, Roe says that since most theists and atheists are going to agree about this premise, This really isn't the one that's sort of up for grabs as far as evaluating the argument overall. We can pretty safely say that premise 2 in the argument from evil, this second point here, is a pretty safe one to believe is true. And that's okay. Even if you disagree with the conclusion, or if you don't find the argument convincing, finding one of the premises true is not a problem for you. It's whether you find all of the premises true. If we've got good reason for believing all of the premises, then we also have good reason for believing the conclusion. And so, whether or not we've got good reason to believe in premise 1, then, is going to be the crux of the evaluation. It's going to be the crux of the debate. If anything is going to be challenged in the argument, it's going to be premise 1. So, in order to establish premise 1, because, Rowe's advancing an argument, he's trying to prove his thesis here, support his thesis statement, Rowe has us consider a forest fire. This is going to be his example of choice. So think of a forest fire. And in that forest fire, a fawn, a baby deer, becomes trapped, horribly burned, and then suffers intensely for several days before finally having its suffering relieved through death. If it helps you to not visualize that too clearly, and instead just think of something in the abstract, think of Bambi. It's sad, it's terrible in every way, but that's the kind of scenario that he's talking about. Now, as far as we can tell, and this is why he has us imagine this terrible scenario, as far as we can tell, this is an example of intense, terrible, pointless suffering. A fawn suffering from burns after a forest fire, with no one around, no other creatures or things to influence it or be influenced by, serves no purpose. There is no greater good attained for the universe by this fawn suffering in the forest fire before finally dying. It prevents no greater evil. It has no moral significance at all in terms of whether it's going to inspire people or prevent some evil or help promote free will. Any of the potential goods you could imagine that God would want to pursue through allowing things like suffering, this fawn isn't going to count towards it. And while he's having us imagine a hypothetical scenario, it's almost 100% certain that this has happened. And if you don't particularly find the fawn convincing, it's not hard to substitute with this. Imagine a starving sub-Saharan African child whose parents have already died, who lives alone, has no food, suffers for days in intense agony before finally perishing. That, I can tell you for a fact, has happened, and it serves the exact same theoretical purpose. It gives us a reason for telling, or for saying, as far as we can tell, that premise 1 is true. Now, Rowe does admit this doesn't totally prove that 1 is true. But we don't have to prove it. Remember, we're not concerned with a definitive, geometric or logical proof that God does not exist. That sort of thing's almost impossible to achieve on either side of this debate. Instead, what we're looking for are rational grounds to believe premise 1. We're looking for a rational basis that justifies, through reason, the idea that premise 1 is true. So, Rowe admits that there might be some form of an unfamiliar good, some good that we can't recognize or see in the situation, that the fawn's suffering does actually promote. Or there might be some hidden evil that our limited human perspectives can't see. But, Rowe says, even admitting that that's a possibility, it's not reasonable to think that sort of thing's true. There's no sort of basis for thinking that's actually the case. Because even if, say, the fawn, in this case, does serve some greater purpose, either promoting good or preventing evil, it seems very unreasonable to say that that's true of all suffering like this. Because unfortunately, the world we live in is full of this kind of thing. It is not difficult to find instances of suffering that inspire no one, that promote nothing, that prevent no great tragedies, and come nowhere near equaling the weight of the suffering that someone, either human or animal, goes through every day on this planet. If this sort of thing bothers you, I highly encourage you to look up charities that could help alleviate these things in the world. This is my ethical plug of the day. So, I guess back on point. Rowe says that even if you could find such a purpose or admit that there might be a hidden purpose to a lot of this suffering, there might be some good or some evil that the suffering either promotes or prevents, there's no rational basis for thinking that's true of all suffering in the world, because there's simply too much of it. There's simply so much that looks exactly like the fawn scenario to say that there's any sort of real justification for thinking that way. So, Rowe says, because we've got rational basis for 1, premise 2 was not really up for grabs. We already have a rational basis for it based on our overall moral thinking, and this is agreed on by both theists and atheists. Then, with 1 and 2 both established, and the fact that it's a valid argument, we have a very solid, perhaps very strong, rational basis for atheism. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no ways to respond to this. The argument from evil may be very powerful. It may be very direct and simple and easy to accept the premises to it, but it doesn't mean that there's no response to it. So Rowe takes a full third of his essay or so to consider 3 general ways that a theist might respond to the argument. And each of these focuses on premise 1, since again we've already talked about the idea that premise 2 is kind of just assumed by everybody involved. If you don't agree with premise 2, you've got enough weird stuff going on with your moral theories and everything else that there's a lot more discussion to be had, so we can't just directly evaluate the argument for you. So, Rowe lays out 3 general ways that a theist might respond to the argument. And the first one barely gets much discussion. It happens. A lot of people do use this method of refuting the argument from evil. That's not necessarily the most convincing or even the most popular among theists. And the first way is simply to say that we don't have good reason to believe in premise 1. So you'd be explicitly rejecting some of Rowe's arguments that we just talked about here. Now, this isn't very popular because this is a strategy that very few theists are actually going to want to use. Most theists are not going to want to say, oh yeah, there's just no reason for thinking that one's the case. Instead, they're going to say something like, no, premise 1 is false. And this is a different and much stronger view than the idea that there's simply no good reason to believe one. So, because most theists aren't going to want to use this way, Rowe briefly considers it but doesn't give it much weight. And really, the proper response on behalf of the atheist or on Rowe's behalf are the arguments that he just gave. He just tried to establish that there is good reason for premise 1. If you disagree with that, then really what you're doing is you're looking at these reasons, this discussion, and saying there's something wrong with it. There's some fault in the reasoning here. And for 1, that's going to be a little bit difficult, and 2, it's generally not strong enough. And before you start thinking that Rowe might be a little bit presumptuous for thinking, this is what most theists are going to want to say, keep in mind that Rowe actually spent the first part of his career, a very large portion of his life, actually attending seminary for evangelical Christianity. He actually was a preacher for the first part of his life before studying philosophy and becoming professor at Purdue. It was only slowly over the course of his life that Rowe eventually turned to atheism. So he's actually incredibly aware of the arguments and the beliefs and the convictions of everyone involved in the debate. And honestly, I think he's probably right here. Majority, at least, of American Christians, usually American Protestant Christians, are going to find method 1 unappealing in some way. So, instead, they're going to use either method 2 or 3, which Rowe discusses as either being directly or indirectly rejecting premise 1. Now, the direct attacks on premise 1 are going to try and reject it and say that premise 1 is false, simply by saying that there is some good that instances of suffering like the fawns will help obtain, or there's some evil that it helps prevent. And these are often brought up in what are called theodicies. A theodicy is not something we're going to study, it's not something you'll be tested on. But theodicies are essentially theist responses to the problem of evil that attempt to give an explanation for why God permits suffering or permits evil the way that he does. And so there's a few usual suspects that come up in these sorts of discussions. Some of the most common goods that theists will cite to try and show that there's a direct, greater good being served or pursued by this suffering are things like free will or developing good character, allowing human beings to strengthen their souls or their conviction or their faith in some way. And these usually go something like this. Take their free will theodicy, which is a very, very popular one, both among academics and non-academics. Free will theodicy says something like, free will is a wonderful thing. It's something that the universe is better for having. It's better that human beings freely choose the things that they do, freely choose to worship, they freely choose to follow the moral law, they freely choose to pursue all of their projects. The world's a better place because of this. However, God can only allow free will to exist, can only have free will exist, if he allows human beings to freely do evil things as well. And so, therefore, God allows suffering and evil in order to allow the greater good of free will to exist. And the other theodicies work the same sort of way. God allows suffering so that we can build better character, or God allows suffering so that our other struggles have meaning, or that we can come to greater faith, or something like that. All of them are basically versions of the same sort of line of attack, the same sort of method of argumentation, where they directly try to say premise one is false. And this method, this general strategy, Rose says, simply doesn't work. For one, it's impossible to know what sort of goods each and every instance of suffering might gain. So, for example, it might be one thing to say that, yeah, sure, a policeman murdering someone in cold blood is a terrible, terrible thing, and God allows it so that that same policeman can have free will in choosing to become a better person or follow morality or anything like that. But what about the fawn? Doesn't seem like free will is really involved in that one. Or take people suffering in a landslide. Doesn't seem like free will is involved there either. So it's difficult to find a good, some sort of a greater good that God's pursuing that covers all of the available cases. And even if you did, it'd be very, very difficult, almost intellectually impossible, for us to actually confidently identify and say this is the good involved in all of those situations rather than some other. And in fact, most theists are going to acknowledge the fact, at least most narrow theists of the sort that we're discussing, theists who believe in an omnicompetent God, most of those theists are going to believe something similar to the idea that they can't know God's reasons for doing anything in particular. So in order to actually use this method of rejecting premise one, most theists are going to have to go against one of their own deeply held beliefs, in addition to surmounting this massive difficulty of identifying some good that will cover all of the available cases. And even if you go kind of pluralistic with it and say that different goods apply to different situations, it's almost impossible to know for a fact that this is actually what's going on. So it's very, very difficult, Rose says, to really have a rational basis for supporting this line of thinking. So this kind of attack on premise one, he thinks, is not very viable. Yeah, sure, it might work. It doesn't seem likely. Now, Rowe says that the indirect way of saying that premise one is false is far, far better. Now, this one is going to look a little bit weird, which is why I've taken the time to write it out instead of just summarizing the discussion that Rowe gives and help to try to explain it. So the indirect method of rejecting premise one is what he calls the G.E. Moore shift. Now, the shift is basically a method of arguing that uses the same sort of argument that G.E. Moore does about knowledge. G.E. Moore talks about the external world, like when we were talking about Descartes and skepticism and all that sort of stuff. Excuse me. When Moore's talking about all that, he basically says that he can reject skepticism by following this kind of odd and unconventional argument. He says that, well, I know that there are certain things outside of my body, such as my hands. Like, look, I've got hands. Look at them. If skepticism were true, I couldn't know that that there are objects outside of my body. I couldn't know that I have hands. Therefore, because I do know that I have hands, I have good reason for rejecting skepticism. It's kind of weird, but it works. Essentially what the argument does is it takes the original form of whatever it is you're talking about. So like say on the right side of your screen, the top argument, P, Q, therefore R. It takes that original argument and it sort of flips it on its head and twists it around a little bit. So instead of going P, Q, therefore R, the shifted argument goes not R, Q, therefore not P. And so for our example, take you out of the letters and the acronyms and stuff and make it make a little more sense, the theist shifted version of the argument from evil is going to go something like this. The theist will say, I've got good reason for thinking that God exists. Now, if God existed, then God would prevent intense suffering unless God could not do so without losing some greater good or permitting some more terrible evil. Therefore, there are no instances of intense suffering that God could prevent without losing some greater good or permitting some greater evil. In other words, rather than saying there is evil, if God, that he would prevent it, therefore not God, the theist can make a logically valid move, flip the thing on its head and say, I've got good reason for thinking that God exists. If God exists, then there wouldn't be suffering. Therefore, these things that look like suffering, that look like intense, unjustified suffering, really aren't intense, unjustified suffering. And this is an entirely logically valid move. If you look at this argument form, this one here on the bottom, the not R, Q, therefore not P, this is entirely logically valid. Any professor could confirm that for you. And, in fact, since I'm your instructor in this case, I can. It's valid. It works. It seems really, really weird, but it works. The problem with this that Rowe says is that even though it's logically valid, and so long as you've got good reason for believing in the existence of God, you have rational basis for being a theist and saying these things, it's in no way convincing to anybody that's not already a theist. Because if this looks weird to you, it's probably not going to convince you that, the fawn's suffering was actually justified and I just don't know how. However, Rowe, being the, just very wise person that he is, somebody who's who has very deeply considered these issues and all the positions and topics and debates surrounding it, he acknowledges that while the argument from evil provides rational basis for atheism, that argument might not also be convincing to theists, and it doesn't entirely rule out the possibility of theism. So even though this sort of argument isn't convincing to an atheist, that doesn't mean that necessarily it's wrong. It's just not convincing. Thus, Rowe actually concludes his essay with a discussion of a couple of possibilities before finally endorsing a position that he calls friendly atheism. Rowe personally is an atheist, or was. He passed away in 2015. Rowe himself was an atheist, and by basing his atheism on these types of arguments, had reason for being an atheist. So he definitely did not believe that an omnicompetent God exists. He rejects theism, as we've been discussing it. However, he also says that some theists do actually have a rational basis for being theists. Being an atheist doesn't have to rule that sort of possibility out. And so that might sound weird to a few of you. How can there be a rational basis for both of these? Well, we're human beings. We're limited. We don't always know everything. So, sometimes it's possible for there to be, in fact, in most of these philosophical debates, there are good reasons for endorsing every side of a position. Now, it doesn't mean that they're all right. Obviously, God cannot both exist and not exist. even God can't do that. But it does mean that there's a reason to respect and have meaningful and purposeful dialogue with the opposing side of any given issue, and try and together work towards the actual truth. Both of you can be reasonable human beings while still believing the things that you do, or that you do based on your reasons, and so on and so forth. So, little life lesson there. You can be rational and be both an atheist and a theist. So, respect those around you. This is your closing life lesson for the Philosophy of Religion unit. But that's not the sort of thing that I want to leave you with. Because, of course, we need to see whether or not Roe is actually correct in believing these sorts of things. He's the guy we studied. He's absolutely brilliant. But then again, everybody we've been studying is absolutely brilliant and very good at this stuff. And obviously, at least a full half of them are wrong on whatever issue they're talking about. So it's worth leaving you with some questions to consider and ponder after seeing all the things that Roe argued. We need to see, and you need to think about, is he correct to hold this kind of position? And to go into the more, thorough and conventional questions, are there other, more convincing theistic responses than the ones that he gives us? Are there versions of theodicies? Are there ways of directly rejecting one? Are there ways of indirectly rejecting one that are actually far more convincing? Is Roe correct in asserting that premises 1 and 2 are both true? Is there something he's overlooked? Is there some fault in his reasoning that just isn't identified? Or, on the flip side, is Roe actually correct in endorsing the friendly atheist position? Is the atheist argument actually much stronger than Roe gives it credit for? Does it actually prove in any way that God definitively doesn't exist? These are possibilities. I'm not saying that any of these are necessarily correct, but they're all things that definitely must be considered, and, like every question and every topic surrounding this, I want you to come to your own conclusions about, because that's half the point of this sort of stuff. It's to help you figure out what it is that you believe, and help give you reasons for that belief. Whatever the truth might be, I want you to try and come to it on your own, rather than being preached at from either side of the debate. So, I leave you with these. I leave you with your ordinary journal questions, your quiz stuff, and all of the other food for thoughts on this and all of our other units. And hope that you give it a more than healthy amount of thought. Good luck. I hope you've enjoyed this so far, and happy thinking.